So thank you all for coming. I really appreciate you being here. Tonight we're going to be talking about the moral argument for God's existence. I do have a new event type that we're going to try out. I can let you know now. We haven't scheduled it in the events yet, but it'll be August 5th at 8 p.m. EST, and we're actually going to have Percy, who will give his exposition or his explanation of the argument from divine hiddenness. He'll do that for 10 minutes. Caleb is going to give a 10-minute reaction, and then we'll go to Q&A, and you can ask either one of them, and it'll be kind of more like almost a debate, but we're going to stick on focus with heavy Q&A. So it'll be a first event of that type for us, so I'm pretty excited about it. You can see our other events. We do have others scheduled in the events tab at the top left. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and give a quick rundown of the argument for God's existence from morality, or at least my version of it. I'll give you that, and then we're going to turn to Q&A. If you have a question, there's a little button with a hand icon at the bottom of the screen. It's got a little piece of paper on it. If you click that, it'll put you in the queue, and then I can send you an invite, which will unmute your mic, and we'll be able to have an interaction. So without further ado, the argument for God's existence, as I explain it, is that if God is the best explanation for moral facts, then moral facts give us reason to believe that God exists. God is the best explanation for moral facts, and therefore moral facts give us good reason to believe that God exists. The first premise is tautological to me. It seems to me that if you got something that's the best explanation for some phenomena, then the phenomena becomes good reason to believe that explanation. The second one, that God is the best explanation for objective moral facts, that's because competing objections suffer from different failures or drawbacks that God does not suffer from. For example, some people will say that objective moral facts can be produced by evolutionary biology. First of all, that doesn't actually undermine the theistic account, because it just explains how we have moral perceptions. It doesn't really explain the existence of moral facts. And number two, if we do want to say that morality really is just evolutionary biology, then we end up with morality being relative to evolutionary biology. And it doesn't seem to us that had evolutionary history gone differently, that things like cruelty and malice could actually be moral goods. At best, evolution being different would give us feelings that malice was good, but it wouldn't actually be good. At least that's what our moral intuitions tell us. In fact, it seems to us that anybody who cherishes or appreciates malice and cruelty is a deeply evil person. We see these characters in films, and they are not the heroes of the story. And so it doesn't seem like evolutionary biology gives a good explanation of moral facts. Some people will try to ground it in society, but the problem there is that, if it were grounded in society, if society determined what it was to be good or evil, then it would have to be the case that there's a one-to-one correspondence between that which society praises and that which is good. But we know that there have been societies that have been unanimous or nearly unanimous in their endorsement of certain things that were in fact evil. For example, Nazi Germany, the final solution. Even though anti-Semitism was greenlit, it was the way that life was in Germany at that time. That certainly was evil, even though it was true of that society. But if it's true that society creates moral facts, then we would expect that, just like we take cultures, cultural expressions to be relativistic, that each culture has an equally valid expression of their artistic expression. We don't have that with morality. It seems like the culture that is fully anti-Semitic, that's evil of the culture. So it doesn't seem like grounding morality in society works for that reason. Another explanation is social contract theory. This is the view that essentially morality is what purely logical, purely rational people would come up with if they were behind a veil of ignorance where there's no self-satisfaction from it. They're not trying to make themselves better, enrich themselves by deciding how the world should be. That such a person acting purely rationally, that's what morality is it's what they would come up with. The problem is that there is no such council, obviously. And so what that theory does is it establishes or it claims that there's a one-to-one correspondence with what is morally right and good for somebody to do, and what's the rational thing to do. The problem is that if on that theory, all that you have to do to undermine the theory is to show that there's some disparity between what makes for being rational and what makes for being moral. For it to really have an identity relationship, then what's true of one would have to be true of another, which would mean that rational mistakes would have to be moral mistakes. And that seems obviously false. If there's a philosophy student who makes a mistake on one of his papers and he affirms the consequent, we don't think he's done something immoral, even if he has done something irrational. And so, since it can be true that it's irrational without it being immoral, then there isn't an identity relationship between what's rational and what's moral. And therefore, social contract theory, at best, it could come up with how we would reason to moral conclusions given certain moral facts. It cannot tell us where those moral facts come from. It cannot establish what those moral facts are. Whereas theism doesn't have that problem. There's no incoherence in saying that moral values are grounded in God's character. God is a necessary being, and so they're true in all possible worlds. So regardless of how world history had gone, God has the same character of being loving and merciful and just. And so love, mercy, and justice would remain moral values. And God's commands are moral duties. There doesn't seem to be any incoherence there. If there's a one-to-one relationship between what God commands you to do, that I don't see how that would conflict with our moral experience of what we experience as our moral obligations and moral duties. So for those reasons, I think that God is the best explanation of moral facts. Moral facts referring to those values and duties. And as we said before, that gives us then good reason to believe that God exists. So if anybody has any questions, again, or objections, whatever, please do hit the hand icon. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the moral argument, or perhaps you have a challenge that I haven't addressed, or you think that there's an atheistic or naturalistic account for objective moral values that works better. I hope you've been able to hear me this whole time. Yeah. Good. Yeah, I just had this fear that, oh, wait, maybe I've been muted this entire time. Hey, hats off. How are you doing?
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation.
Yeah, absolutely.
I guess
I'm
it was
glad to hear
shorter
you
than
could hear
it
me.
was shorter than I expected.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well,
so
what I try
yeah,
to
go
do
ahead.
with these in theory is like I really want to focus on audience Q&A and interactions with the audience. And so what we try to do in all of our sessions is give like a 10-minute, here's the broad strokes, and then when you come up and we have interactions, we can go deeper on topics. And so that's kind of why for this and for all, of our events, I really want to keep the initial presentation very, very short so that then we can have a longer Q&A time.
Yeah, no, that's cool. So okay, so you say that moral values are grounded in God's character.
Hmm.
Now, you're a reasonable faith chapter guy, right? So you probably, I don't want to put views into your head or
Hmm.
words into your mouth if you like, but but now Craig will say, there's we can have kind of an understanding of morality apart from the grounding that God gives. So there's
Sure.
the kind of way that we make sense of morality, and then there's the concrete grounding, if you like, that God gives to morality. Are you in agreement with that? The reason I ask, because I hate leading questions, so I always like to say why I'm asking. The reason I ask is because if there is some kind of understanding of morality, and I've never understood this. This goes back to I debated somebody with somebody else who was like the I forget the Chicagoland chapter of Reasonable Faith years ago. Um, he also gave kind of the same argument, right? And it's like, well, but if you have like a semantic understanding of what morality is, then like what does the supposed grounding add to that? Why not just have the semantic understanding and leave it at that? I guess I've never understood that, but maybe you could, you know, enlighten me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll actually let you know something that I was shocked to learn is that they have very, very recently discovered how anesthesia works. And up until now, what they've been doing is they experiment with doses and well, this much knocks him out and more kills him, and so I guess we'll just give him this amount. But they've had no idea how any of it works. They just know if they give you X amount, you don't die, but you do fall asleep. And so what we have here is we have the ability to know how anesthesia, how to use anesthesia. We can understand how it is that anesthesia is as far as the amounts and how to use it, what's the utility of it, and what we ought to or ought not use with anesthesia. But they've only recently learned how it is that exactly what it is that anesthesia is doing. I don't know what anesthesia does, but they've recently discovered it apparently. And so what that tells me is that there's two things to be known. There's the sort of, as you say, semantic utility or the ethics of morality. And you can learn that, but there's still a fact of the matter of why it is that justice is good, why it is that you ought not torture children for fun. Just like even though you can operate in medicine perfectly well with just a knowledge of how much anesthesia to use, there's still a fact of the matter of what it is that anesthesia is doing in the body. And that's what they've discovered recently. And so that's what I would say is discovering the ontology of morality is not necessarily going to mean that you're going to make different ethical decisions. It doesn't automatically make that the case, but we're not looking for what's our best way of reasoning to right or wrong. Rather, what we're saying is, well, there's these moral facts that we experience, and there's some fact of the matter as to why they're true rather than false. And so we're exploring different explanations for what it is. And again, I make the case that God is the best explanation for what makes those facts true. Does that answer your question, or have I missed it?
No, that directly answered. I mean, it's obviously I'm not satisfied, but of course I'm not right. But yeah, you answered my question.
Well, are you a moral realist or are you a moral anti-realist?
Oh man, I don't know. So there's pros and cons to both sides, right? So
Okay.
I'm very, very sympathetic to the view that it's subjective. I
Okay.
don't think I like that view. Um, I think, and I hate to use this analogy, but like the chess analogy, right? I'm sure you've heard the chess analogy, right? Within the context of the game, like there are
Hmm.
objective things that you can say, right?
Yeah. Well, the thing is that kind of really works towards the theistic conclusion, right? So, just for anybody in the audience who may not know where you're getting at, maybe you could explain the chess analogy, and then we'll explore it further.
Yeah. So my version of the chess analogy is the basketball analogy. So the basketball analogy is where, okay, so the rules of the game are human inventions, right? We could make the rules this way or that way, right? But once the rules are established, once you're playing the game, right? Then it's good to hit a three-pointer. It's good to score points. It's good to block a shot, and so on, right? So, but it's like, well, okay, but you can say, well, what if we rise above that context? Well, isn't it arbitrary? And I mean, I guess kind of in a sense, although there are always considerations about being fun. Every time you think you're out of a context, you're still in a context. This is my own addition to it, right? This isn't the typical analogy. So you can't really ever break out of the box. You can't ever break out of the context, but you can step outside into a larger context. But within the context of the game, there are objective right and wrong things, even if there are gray areas, which is lacking in chess, I think, perhaps not so much in basketball. There are gray areas, but they're still objectively good things, and um, even though it's in some sense arbitrary.
Yeah, so I think even somebody who doesn't know much about basketball should agree that it's objectively true, and it is objectively true, that it's good to take the ball away from the other team. you know, that's an objectively good move, right? It wouldn't be a bad move or possibly a bad move, or some people might be right if they think it's a bad move. No, it's always a good idea to take the basketball away. And so then we look, okay, well, what if that's what's going on with morality? And really, that's the theistic framework. We're saying that there is an intelligence that has designed the rules for the game, and that what makes for these objectively right or wrong decisions is that there was this intelligent and purposeful hand behind the game. Basketball didn't come together naturalistically. People invented it. And so we think that, and there's a guy online, he does some YouTube channel stuff. His name's Slivin. I wish I could give him credit. Sorry, whoever that is, I can't remember him now. But anyway, he makes the case that there are these prudential aunts and that they're objectively true without reference to God. Like not just like in basketball, that's a prudential ought. Is you ought to take away the basketball because of some objective goal. And so, I would say that prudential oughts do require an intelligence. Now, prudential oughts can be moral or amoral. Taking a basketball away isn't a moral thing to do or an immoral thing to do. But nonetheless, if it's the case that we're saying that prudential oughts are analogous to moral oughts, then like prudential oughts, moral oughts require an intelligence. They require a purpose. And so we find that we have these moral oughts, and then we ask, well, what's the best explanation for them? Whose purpose is it that determines these? And so there seems to be basically two possibilities. There's either the individual or there's the society. If it's the individual, then it's you determine your own oughts. But that seems really incorrect. I mean, the rapist who loves raping, and so he decides that it's good for him to rape. He's wrong. It's not just that, well, he has a different set of prudential goals that he's set for himself. No, you don't get to set for yourself that it's good that you rape people, right? And so it doesn't seem to us that it's relative to the individual. Somebody can be wrong about the moral oughts that they want to pursue. And then again, we look back at society and say, okay, well, what if society is what creates these prudential oughts, or these moral oughts, I should say. And as I said before, if that were the case, then whatever it is that the society chooses as the goal or as the design or purpose of the society would therefore, by definition, be what you morally ought to do. And in that case, what we would have is we'd have a scenario where social reformers, moral reformers, people who buck against the societal exceptions, what society accepts, we would see them as evil because they're by definition going against what is the good, that is, or what is the right, I should say, and that's what society determines. And we don't have that experience. We look at people like Martin Luther King Jr., for example, and we think, well, his stand for civil rights was good, even if it was denied both by law and by culture at large. And so it doesn't, it still seems, even under that framework, like God is the best explanation for these moral oughts. Do you have any further thoughts on that, or?
Well, I do. I don't want to dominate the conversation. I keep waiting
Oh,
for
there's
the people.
nobody else in queue. One thing
Um,
I do think that brings up that is important to realize that there's a distinction between duties and values. Is that when we're grounding moral facts in God, moral values are necessary. God is just or loving or merciful in all possible worlds, but duties are contingent, right? Because it's a command. It's a thing you do, and because it's an event of Him commanding, it is by definition contingent. So there are possible worlds where there are no moral duties. For example, if God had refrained from creating anything at all, and God is the only thing that exists, well, He doesn't issue commands to Himself, and so in that world there would be moral values because there'd still be God, but there wouldn't be moral commands. And so I think that the prudential analogy is actually a fair one for that reason, that these prudential oughts are contingent on the purpose that you choose. And then we're just looking for who it is that sets that purpose. And who set up basketball is, I don't know the history of basketball, but presumably there's some sort of group that came up with that. And so I don't think that actually, I think some people are uncomfortable with thinking that moral duties are contingent, but that's actually at home in the theistic framework.
So this is such a tough issue because there are so many you know corners and facets of it. Um, I'm and there's so many different directions you could go, right? So like I'm very tempted to say because you keep saying that theism is the best explanation,
Mm-hmm.
and there are kind of two things you have to show there, right? You have to show first of all, right, that non-theistic explanations are somehow not good, right? And then you also have to show that the theistic explanation is good. It's not good enough, in other words, to say, well, okay, it's the best of a bad lot. No, it has to be a good explanation in its own right, and we haven't really touched on that. But I kind of don't want to. I kind of want to roll with this analogy again,
Mm-hmm.
because you were saying that maybe I misunderstood you. You were saying something about basketball goals being prudential, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think they seem to be prudential,
That I mean,
right?
in a certain sense, that's true.
If you want to win the
But
game, then you ought to take the ball.
yeah. So there are limits to any analogy, and I'm not going to pretend this is a perfect analogy, but there is a virtue to this analogy. The chess analogy, I think, doesn't have. Or maybe it does. I don't know. Maybe you could adapt this. But suppose that you did start twisting the rules of basketball as you imagine, a majority might, or anybody might twist the rules of morality, or try to do so, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you twist the rules of basketball enough, you might have a different game.
Mm-hmm.
But I think at a certain point you no longer call it basketball. If whatever you if whatever you changed basketball into, and I'm kind of building that in, so maybe I shouldn't phrase it that way. If whatever rule changes you made you step back and think, wait a second, this just, man, I don't feel right calling this basketball.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think that is perhaps analogous to what you are saying, where the majority can try to institute various values, but at a certain point, you wouldn't call it morality anymore. In the same sense that if you changed the rules enough in basketball, you wouldn't call that basketball anymore either. And finally, somebody else is raising their hand, so I shall.
Well, I do think that on. Let me just respond, and then I'll give you the last word, and then we can go to Joel. I do think that there's. I think the reason that you would think that if you change the rules of basketball, then at some point we no longer have basketball. I think you're imagining a world where we have both basketball and basketball with these changed rules. In which case, yeah, they're not identical. So if you have basketball and perhaps you have it in the past, and so it's been changed, so you've got this future state and you've got this past state. I think that, yeah, in that world, if you're comparing the both, they're non-identical. So if the first one is basketball, then the second one can't be identical to basketball. So I think that that's kind of where the difference lies. And so I think that's why you have that feeling, or why we might have that feeling, that if you changed it enough, it wouldn't be basketball anymore. However, if it's the case that when they came up with basketball, they had come up with a different set of rules, then that would be basketball. We wouldn't have any other basketball. That would be what it is. And so I'm not sure about that. However, what I will say is that there certainly are cases where I think your feeling is that if they're contingent, or if they're prudential, if moral values or moral duties are prudential, yeah, I guess I'm not sure beyond that how exactly it would be a challenge. I do think that what you're thinking of is, if we've got this set of basketball duties, you might say, and we've got a new set, then they would be non-identical. So I'm not sure how that would undermine the view that our moral duties are grounded in God's commands. But I'll let you have the last word, and maybe to explain that, and then we'll go to Joel.
Well, I don't I don't think that. So I think, who was it, Peter Slezak, who said that there may be a correspondence of prudential and moral duties, but if there is such a correspondence, it's accidental or coincidental. I'm not trying to argue that moral duties are prudential duties. Um, that's what I meant when I said that there are limits to the basketball analogy. That's
Oh, sure.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
Um,
I don't think they're prudential either.
but anyway, yeah, I will yield. And hey, there you go.
All right. Thanks, hats off. I appreciate it. What I'll do then, since we don't have a lot of questions, I'll raise an objection that Wes Morris. Oh, well, there's Scott. We'll go to Scott first, and then see if we have time to go with Wes Morrison's objection. Hey, Scott, how you doing?
I mean, I'm doing well, thank you. If you want to go ahead and start with the objection, I can just
No, no,
hold
you
my
first. You're
comment.
here. Morrison's not here.
I wanted to give you some content, if you didn't have any otherwise. So I'd like to kind of explore you. You made mention of some objections to the argument along the lines of evolutionary psychology and social contract and of the like, and I think those are kind of in the same space. I'd like to better understand why you don't think those provide an adequate alternative explanation for how we arrive at a system of ethics. So you would say, I think you had said that we would think something seems good, but it would not actually be good. And I don't think I fully understand that or understood that correctly.
Oh no, yeah, not. I wasn't quite saying that, but rather, I think we can take like mathematics for example. So on the naturalistic evolutionary account, our cognitive faculty to apprehend mathematical truths is something that we gain from evolution. That we have some sort of evolutionary advantage for being able to, I don't know how much supplies we have maybe or something like that. And so we have this ability to apprehend mathematical truths. Well, at best, what the evolutionary history can show is how we came to apprehend or how we came to, how it is that we have this perception of mathematical truths. But it doesn't explain why 2 plus 2 is 4. It doesn't even attempt to do that. At best, it says, why is it that humans can know or can apprehend that 2 plus 2 equals 4 in a way that, an amoeba or a sponge or a house cat, how they can't do math like that. I'm assuming on the house cat. I don't know. I never given them a quiz. So at best, evolutionary psychology can tell how we can perceive them, but it doesn't give us the ontology of them. And the moral argument deals with the ontology. Why is it that these moral facts are true? Same thing with social contract theory. It seems to me that when we're coming, that at best we can reason from moral starting points or moral axioms to moral conclusions about what you ought or ought not do from those moral axioms. If you're disinterested personally and you want your best shot or your best chances at having it. So you have a few moral values baked into the cake with that one, and then you're reasoning from those. And so at best that shows how we can engage in ethical reasoning, but it doesn't show us why it is that these moral axioms are true. And so that's what I would say is that our ability to think about or apprehend these things is different from the things themselves being true. That's kind of earlier on, Hatzoff had brought up, and we talked a bit about like painkillers and how, yeah, you can learn to use anesthesia without knowing why it is that it works, but there's still a fact of the matter as to why it works. And the same thing with morality is that we might use logic or evolutionary development to learn how to apprehend or to use, if that's the right word, morality, but that wouldn't give us the fact of the matter as to why these moral facts are in fact facts.
Okay, thank you. I think I better understand, although I may not have a quite adequate understanding. To me, that seems somewhat like putting the cart before the horse, in that it seems to be asserting that there is some underlying moral fact, like let's say murder is bad, and therefore we came to behave in such a way or view it in such a way because of that. Whereas I think it makes more sense, or at least it makes sense from the evolutionary history perspective, that certain things simply work. So, for example, humans that went around killing every other human they saw instantly weren't very successful at reproducing, whereas humans who were relatively social and able to get along with other humans were successful. And therefore, because that worked, we retroactively labeled that behavior good because it is successful. It produces the kind of society that we are adapted to, that we like. Um, so it seems like it's not that something is good, therefore we behave that way. It's more we behave that way, and therefore we label that behavior as good. I think you could make a similar argument like we're evolved omnivores. Some people think that only vegetarianism or veganism is ethical behavior. Had we been evolved herbivores, I think it seems to me like society would largely say that anyone engaging in any carnivory would be just opaquely evil. They would be, or clearly evil. They would just seem totally unnecessary and like you're hurting animals for no reason. But we've grown up with a history where we do in fact hurt animals to survive, and society at large is relatively okay with that.
Sure. So I'd give a couple of responses there. First is that actually concedes the major point that I'm making, because it's essentially taking the moral anti-realist view and saying, well, there are no objective moral facts, and evolutionary history can tell us why we have these moral feelings, but there are no underlying facts. And so my claim is that evolutionary psychology or evolutionary history can't give us the moral facts, and the objection is evolutionary history can't give us the facts, and there are no facts. And so it seems like we would then agree that evolutionary history can't give us objective facts. At best, evolutionary history can give us why it is that we have these perceptions about morality. So that's the first thing I would say is we agree on that, that evolutionary history doesn't give you objective facts. But then the question is, okay, well, why? What about the anti-realist position? Why should we take the anti-realist position? And the problem there is, I think that you'd have to deny our moral experience. And in fact, we do have people who eat very odd things. I saw this show, My Strange Addiction, a while back, and there was this lady who kept eating chalk, and she just like compulsively ate chalk. We didn't think that she was doing something evil, even though that is opposed to her evolutionary history and her biological hardwiring, so to speak. And yet we don't see that as immoral, or we see it as odd. But when it comes to murdering children, we don't think of that as simply odd. We think of it as immoral. And even things that don't seem to hurt other people, like somebody who's self-absorbed in narcissism, we see that as wrong. You shouldn't be that way, even though it's not like torturing children where it's hurting somebody else. It still seems wrong to us that somebody should be a self-absorbed narcissist, in a way that we don't think, it seems wrong to us that you should eat chalk. There's like a category difference there. And so it seems in our moral apprehension or moral perception, we do perceive a world of objective moral values and duties. It seems to us, through our moral perception, that these things really are right or wrong, or really are good or evil. And so in as much as our perceptions count as evidence for the things we perceive, our moral perceptions count as evidence for the moral facts that we perceive. And so that's kind of how I would respond to that objection. But I'll give you the last word if you want to come back on that, and then we'll go back to Joel, and hopefully his mic is working.
Okay. I guess I would bring up the issue of people having genuine disagreements about what moral facts are. And I guess we could invoke biblical stories in this event. So there's the story of Abraham and Isaac, the story of Job, or whenever Yahweh commands genocide. So just going back to Abraham and Isaac, Yahweh is commanding Isaac to sacrifice his son. And that might, to most people, I think, would seem wrong. Like just killing your own child seems flatly wrong. But if we accept that Yahweh embodies moral perfection, then there is some good reason for this that Abraham does not understand. It's beyond his understanding. His perception of what the moral fact is exists, but is wrong. He is falsely perceiving a moral fact because it is in fact this other way. Same thing with Job. Job might not understand why all these bad things are happening to him, yet they are in fact good to happen to him because Yahweh is morally perfect. And if that is the case, if they can have a false perception of moral facts, then we could you and I could have a false perception of moral facts. In fact, we could have a systemic error. Slavery could in fact be good, and Yahweh could deem it to be good, and we just got it all wrong, thinking that's wrong. Like abolition is actually incredibly evil, but we're just mistaken about that and mistaken in a way we don't understand. And if you accept that we can be wrong about moral facts, then I think the argument kind of it depends upon moral facts actually existing. So that would be my final statement regarding that.
All right. Well, yeah, I'll try to come back to that later. But like I said, I said I'd give you the last word, and then we'll go to Joel. So let me go ahead and move you to the audience, and hopefully Joel is working there. Hey, hats off. Welcome back.
If you want to respond to Joel, I think that would be a good idea.
Okay. Yeah. Did he post it already?
Scott, I mean to say.
Oh, okay, perfect. Sure. So Scott made a couple of claims. The first was to say that moral disagreement, or perhaps imperfect moral perception, would imply that there isn't an objectivity to that which we perceive, and that I would say that we have good reason to doubt that. The fact that we have disagreement about something doesn't imply that there's not an objective fact of the matter. We have disagreements about things which there's obviously an objective fact of the matter all the time. For example, there's something like 10 or 11 different interpretations of quantum mechanics. So there's people who disagree about what's going on in the quantum realm. But there surely is a fact of the matter in the quantum realm. And so I don't think that disagreement or moral disagreement implies that there isn't a fact of the matter, an objective fact of the matter. And then, faultiness in our moral perceptions, I don't think that undermines the validity of those perceptions either. I wear corrective eyewear, and so my visual perceptions are imperfect. And not just that, but all humans, our visual perceptions are imperfect because our brains take a lot of shortcuts, which are sometimes it's unnerving to find out how many shortcuts our brains take when it builds our field of view. But nonetheless, we don't have a perfect perception. That's why we're susceptible to things like magic tricks, is because we don't perceive things perfectly. Our brains take shortcuts, for example. But still, there are physical objects around us that we're perceiving. Even if our vision is not perfect, that doesn't undermine the fact that we can use those perceptions to, for example, see the stove that's over there. I can be right in thinking that there's a stove over there, even if I know that my perceptions are faulty and prone to failure. And so in the same way, I don't think that the mere fact that we can have faulty moral perceptions implies that there is no fact of the matter. And in fact, the Christian story itself gives an explanation for how it is that we came to have faulty moral perceptions. We recognize that, whether you're a Christian or not, that people aren't perfect. We all know that. And so we think we're morally imperfect. And whatever the ground is for moral values, it would, by definition, be perfect, because if it grounds moral values and there's a one-to-one correspondence between whatever it is that's grounding it and it, I don't mean one-to-one in identity, but one-to-one in the sense that there's a correspondence. Everything that's moral is grounded in the thing that grounds morality generally. And so it would be morally perfect, and we're not morally perfect. And so I think given that, we'd expect that we have some imperfections that the grounds for moral values doesn't have. And so there would be disagreement that we would have, even with God, over moral values. And when that happens, our awareness of our moral failings and our moral corruption should give us reason to think that we're the ones who are wrong rather than the standard itself. Just like if I saw a rod and I thought, well, that rod can't be 3 meters, or 1 meter, but somebody's holding it to the national standard of meter sticks, and I say, well, it still doesn't look like a meter to me. I should instead think, well, my visual perceptions are sometimes wrong, but there's the meter stick right there that determines how long a meter is. And so I should say, well, it must be my visual perception that's wrong. And I think that that's what's going on when we have these other perceptions where, God's wrong, for example, for commanding the destruction of the Canaanites, the destruction of their culture. Although I do think it's wrong to cast that as a genocide. That's a bit off topic for here. But the point is that, we would expect God to be issuing commands that we don't understand or that we disagree with, given our awareness of our own corruption. But that's my response to Scott. What was on your mind? Hats off.
Yeah, thank you. So, oh shoot. You know what? Why
Have
don't
I
we have
stumped you with my wit?
No, it's not that. No,
It's definitely
no.
not that.
You know what?
I know
I
it's
do.
not
I do
that.
remember what I was going to say. Thank you for,
Okay.
for breaking me out of my reverie there. No, I do remember exactly what I was going to say because I was thinking about what you were saying, and then I lost track of what I was thinking.
Okay.
So as I said before, right, there are like many different directions. You alluded to one of them just now. You said, we don't want to get off tangent on how, the God of the Bible is immoral, and I feel your pain there. I don't think that's an irrelevant tangent. I'm not going to go there. I don't think it's irrelevant. Just if anyone did bring it up,
Oh, sure.
um,
Yeah, it's not irrelevant to Christianity for sure. But the moral argument per se isn't an argument for Christianity specifically. So one could, for example, hold that there is a perfect being who is God and not be a Christian. And so we're just talking about broadly, does such a being as what we call God exist?
yeah, that's true. But a lot of the motivate. But never mind. What I was going to say was, so this reminds me of the presuppositionalist approach. And no, I'm not comparing. I think you're much better than that. Um, I hope you are.
Oh,
Uh,
thank you.
the presuppositional approach is aimed at kind of tripping people up on stuff like logic, right? It's like, how do you ground logic? Well, nobody really knows. We have promising leads, but no theory is perfect. Um, and that's how philosophy is, right? Like, we don't really have a grapple on this sort of thing. We have promising avenues. And so when I give like the basketball analogy or something like that, or the chess analogy or whatever, right? I don't mean that to be, this is it. This is what explains it. When I say, well, we have a semantic standard and that should be good enough, I don't mean that in an absolute sense. I'm saying these are promising avenues. I'm sure it's not exactly like that, but maybe something like that is true, right? And so the challenge, I think, is for the theist to say, well, but we have this alternative, right? And so the theistic explanation has many problems, as I'm sure you're aware. And I think you will say, well, but we have promising avenues to resolve those difficulties, right? And it's kind of the same sort of thing. And so that's all I wanted to say.
Sure, yeah, yeah, and I guess I mean, especially with the basketball analogy, when you say that it's something like that, um, I just want to point out my response was to agree and say the something like that is exactly what I'm saying. That there is a intelligent purpose that brought about the rules of morality, and so yeah, I do think it's something like that. And again, like when we go back to the way I formulated the argument, it is different than most formulations. And just to kind of repeat it again, Scott, thank you for posting it in general. I probably should have read the premises off at the beginning. But it was one, if God is the best explanation for moral facts, then moral facts give us reason to believe that God exists. God is the best explanation for objective moral facts, therefore God exists. And so you'll notice that I'm not saying that God is the only explanation, or that God is, that there's no possible other explanation even. I'm just saying that God is the best explanation. I think that God as an explanation for moral facts at least suffers from fewer difficulties, and certainly no irresolvable difficulties, in the way that these other explanations seem to falter. But I'll give you the last word, and then we'll try Joel once again.
Yeah, so with the presuppositional approach, they're always trying to trap you, right? And so usually with the precepts, I just say, hey, I don't know, and I'm not going to venture a guess. It's your job. But with this, it's very nice. So I appreciate your candor, and it's very nice to be able to actually like kind of speak my mind. So thank you very much. And yeah.
Sure, yeah, you might find this funny. Presuppositions yell at people like me. I, it's the weirdest thing. They say like I'm undermining God or I'm undermining the Bible or by trying to give reasons that And I'm like, what? Like, where are you coming from? You know, so yeah, it's the strangest thing, especially when like it says in the Bible that you should be able to give reasons for the hope that's in you. I mean, that's a command. You know, so like, why are you yelling at me for doing what it is that Peter tells us to do? But yeah, I don't understand the presuppositionalists either. So I share your pain there. But yeah, thanks for your comments, and let's see if Joel's new earphones are working. I hope they are. Joel, can we hear you?
Am I audible?
Oh my gosh, this is the best thing that's happened tonight is we can hear you. This is
This raises the possibility of Christian theism, right?
yeah, exactly. This is a maximally good result, and so clearly.
Yeah. Okay. Good. I did want to ask. Let me preface by saying, like, I am a fan of moral arguments. I do think they work. I don't think the objections to them are successful, but I don't. There are still interesting, to think about nonetheless. So when you read guys like Wielenberg and Morrison and Kuhns and Armstrong, basically what their idea is like, what is God doing to explain these facts that our theories, right? Whether it's you know Wielenberg's godless normative realism, or you can, I guess, even challenge the fact that there even needs to be an explanation. Like, it's just brute, right?
Mhm.
It like Murray just like is wrong, and that's that, But what would you kind of say to that? Like, you know, when we add God to, like, murder, right?
Mhm.
What is it about, like, his commands or something that by the way, I don't think this works, but what would you say? I'm interested in hearing your response. What would you say to that? Like, what is it about that God, right? This extra thing here that makes it the case that murder is wrong.
Yeah, so I would kind of want to I want to break that down along two lines because you brought up Willenberg. So first of all, what about the appeal to brute facts for moral explanation? Well, a brute fact is a fact that's true, and there's literally just no explanation for why it's true. It's just true, full stop. And in that case, I think that that isn't really an objection to the argument that I've offered because it's not an explanation. In fact, it's a denial that there is an explanation. So if it's the case,
Oh,
that's
my bad, my bad. Yeah, yeah. Let me just one thing. I didn't mean to say it like that. I mean, like, so like Chris Heathwood argues this, but it like challenging that, you know, uh, that part about like it needing an explanation, rather just
mhm.
saying that, like, instead of saying like, oh, it has no explanation, more like, why think it even needs one? You know what I mean?
Yeah, sure. And like I was saying, like first of all, I do think that explicability is better than, you know, if you have a ready explanation at hand. So we can get to that, but my first point is that it doesn't undermine the argument that I'm making. That if the claim is, well, you know, there's no explanation, but it doesn't need one, that's still not a better explanation than an actual explanation. And so it would still be the case that God is the best explanation of moral facts, even if you want to have this alternative of saying that there's no explanation at all. It would still be the case that God is the best explanation. And then the question would be, well, that objection then would be to premise, I believe it's one, that if God is the best explanation of moral facts, then moral facts give us good reason to believe that God exists. Now, the reason why I think that that's true is because that's how we use explanations in every other area. So, for example, in science, if we have some explanation, some theory that explains a phenomena, then we're going to say that that theory is justified by the phenomena. And so, I think that we run into real problems if we say, even if we have a ready explanation at hand, why not just discard it and say there's no explanation at all? I think that that proves too much. I think that would end up undermining any explanation of anything. If we say, well, if we have a ready explanation, we have to first show that it needs one. No, I think we should prefer explicability over inexplicability. And so that's kind of how I would respond to that. However, I will point out that Wahlenberg doesn't argue, his position isn't that that brute facts, his position isn't it doesn't need an explanation. His position is that theism and divine command theory rely on brute facts just as much as atheism. So basically what he says is, since both theories have to appeal to brute facts, then the fact that atheism has to appeal to brute facts is no deficiency in atheism. And the reason he says this is he says that at bottom, the theist, especially the divine command theorist, has to say that it's just true that we ought to obey God's commands, and that we have that ought, right? And then from that ought, all the other oughts follow. And then you ask, well, why is that true? Why is it true that we ought to obey God's commands? And it can't be because God commands us to, because then we ought to. Why we ought to obey that one? And so Waylenberg's position is basically that that the theist is in the same boat as the atheist, and so there's just no advantage on the theist side. And my response there would be twofold. First of all, even if we granted that, we still wouldn't be in the case of brute facts for moral values, because there's an identity relationship being posited between moral values and God's character traits, and that's analytically true then at that point. And analytic truths are not brute facts. So, for example, H2O is dihydrogen monoxide. That's not a brute fact. That's just an analytic fact. It's true by definition. And so, it still wouldn't be, even if we granted Waylenberg's point, we still wouldn't have brute facts for values in the way that it seems atheism would need to. But secondly, I don't think that divine command theory is committed to brute facts in the way that Waylenberg imagines, because we would say that it's analytically true of God that God has divine authority to issue such commands. In fact, a test for an analytic truth is that if somebody can doubt the truth, then while understanding the components or the terms being used or the concept being employed, then it's not an analytic truth. So, for example, if somebody doubted, why think that H2O is comprised of dihydrogen monoxide? Well, it's because they don't understand what H2O stands for. That's why. It's because they just don't understand what the terms mean. In the same way, if you ask, well, why is it that God has divine authority? You certainly don't understand the Christian conception of God. It's analytically true of God that he has such an authority. That's one avenue. That's the avenue that I prefer. Another avenue could be that God has authority to issue his commands in virtue of his being our creator. And his being our creator is true. It's a historic fact, and so it's true as an event in history. And then that we ought to obey, that creator, being a creator conveys authority or prerogatives over one's creation, seems also to be analytically true, that's true of the concept of being a creator. And in fact, that concept is so ingrained in our society that if you go to work for a tech company, for example, I worked for a tech company for a while, they literally make you sign an agreement that anything that you create while on the job, they own. And the reason they have to do that is because the implication or the intuition is that if you create it, you own it in some way. And so they want to very specifically spell out that, no, we're paying you to make it, we own it. And that's how strong our intuition is, that if you make something, you own it. That's where copyright laws come from. They codify this intuition. And so it does seem to us inherent in the concept of a creator that he has prerogatives over creation. So either way, I prefer the divine authority approach because I think that that's closer to the Christian conception of God. But I think it would also be true in virtue of God's being our creator. Either way, we're appealing to analytic truths rather than brute facts. And so I don't think that divine command theory has to appeal to brute facts in the way that Waylenberg imagines. Do you have any further thoughts or comments? Oh no, have we lost him again? All right, yeah, maybe try again, and maybe you can put your hand back up if you get it worked out. In the meantime, since we have nobody else in the queue, I thought I would explain Wes Morrison's objection to divine command theory. And divine command theory is for most people how they present the moral argument. When they say, well, how is it that, we have to give why is it that God is an explanation of moral duties? Usually it's going to be something like divine command theory. Divine command theory is the view that our moral obligations are identical to God's commands. That's what it is to be a moral obligation, is to be commanded by God. Wes Morrison wrote a paper. I'm blanking on the name of the paper, but it's something like, would you eat your babies if God commanded you to, or something like that. Or maybe it's God grounding real God and moral grounding or something. Apologies to Dr. Morrison for forgetting the title of the paper, but you should be able to Google it and find it. At any rate, he makes the case, an argument something like, if your moral duties are comprised of God's commands, then if God can, or he just says that. In premise one, and this is just for the sake of the argument, he's granting this to make a reductio ad absurdum argument. Our moral duties are comprised of God's commands. That's the divine command theorist's proposal. And then he goes on from there saying, if our moral duties are composed of God's commands, then we are morally obligated to do whatever God commands us to do. That's premise 2. Premise 3, if God commanded you to eat your children, then you would be obligated to eat your children. And it sort of follows from these premises that we've had before. And then he goes on to say, well, but it could never be the case that you're obligated to eat your children. Obviously, you're not obligated to eat your children. And so therefore, it can't be the case that God's commands are what comprise your moral duties. And he says that the theist will often try to respond saying, yeah, but God would never command such a thing. And he admits that. He says that, yeah, the Christian conception of God, God's not, the Christian God, as we understand it, wouldn't command you to eat your children. But we can still consider what's called the contrapossible premise. And that's where you're supposing, you're giving an antecedent that you think is impossible, but nonetheless saying what follows from it. And actually the moral argument is composed this way from the theist perspective. If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Well, the theist thinks it's impossible that God doesn't exist, and yet he thinks that we should be able to consider this premise of the moral argument. And so if that's the case, then why not consider this premise of his argument if God were to command you to eat your children? And I agree with him there. I don't think that you can get out of this argument by simply saying, well, God would never command that. Because again, we appeal to contrapossibles all the time. And in some sense, counterfactuals, I think, give us a reason to think we should be able to reason through these sorts of arguments as well. And so, yeah, I think his response to that objection is good. We have to deal with the argument. And what I would say is it's a contrapossible argument. My response is to say that he has a contrapossible premise in it. And basically, whenever you have a contrapossible antecedent, then maybe it implies the consequent, but it still isn't the case that the antecedent and consequent obtain in any possible world. And so what he's relying on is your intuition that there is no possible world in which you would be obligated to eat your children. But that doesn't imply that there is a possible world where God commands it. And since in no possible world, are you obligated to eat your children, then therefore you would not be obligated even if God commanded it. I think that he's sort of accepting that it's a contrapossible premise, but then treating it like it's not a contrapossible premise. If he's really accepting that it is a contrapossible premise, then yeah, it's going to result in a contrapossible consequent. That is that you should eat your children. And yeah, the fact that we say we should never eat our children, there's no possible world in which we would be obligated to eat our children, can just as easily give us reason to think that there's no possible world where God commands that. And so I don't think that the argument has the force that Dr. Morrison thinks it does, because he would have to show that there is a possible world where God would command that, and yet we wouldn't have that duty. And I think, I want to say it was either Hatzoff or Scott brought up earlier, where we have cases in the Bible where God commands things that, absent God's commands, would be evil. So set aside genocide. Israel engages in aggressive military conflict to take the land from the Canaanites. Now we would recognize, look at Ukraine. We would recognize that, generally speaking, that would be evil. However, there are reasons to think that God would have the authority to do such a thing, and God would have the authority to command that. And so there are things that would be wrong absent God's commands, but are not wrong with God's commands. And if you want to see what God's moral reasoning are for the conquest in Canaan, I definitely recommend "Is God a Moral Monster" by Paul Copan. He goes over some of the absolute horrors that were going on in Canaan at the time. I think that if you read a little bit about Canaanite culture, you'll understand why it is that they came under judgment from God, and why it is that God would put an end to that culture. And also, it's helpful to understand that they were using what's called exaggerated hyperbolic wartime rhetoric. That was a particular way of writing at their time, where they kind of exaggerated what it was they were saying. We can see this because they'll say they completely annihilated and killed everybody in this people group, and then like a chapter later, they're having interactions with that people group. And that's because neither the author nor the audience thought that was literal. Just like we would say if a basketball team slaughtered their opponents last night, we wouldn't think that's literal. We understand that there's exaggerated sports rhetoric. Well, they had exaggerated wartime rhetoric, and that was just the feature of their culture. That's how they wrote. And so, it's not, I don't think it's as bad as some people make it out to be by reading a very literalistic account into the Old Testament passages. But again, we're not debating Christianity per se here tonight. But just to say that it is true that there are things that would be wrong if God didn't command it, and that they're not wrong if God does command it. But I don't see how that undermines divine command theory. That's just a consequence of divine command theory. You have to show that it's actually absurd in order for that to by itself to undermine divine command theory. And I don't think Dr. Morrison has done that. But I see that J Buff has his hand up. Let me go ahead and send that out to you. J Buff, I got an invite out to you. What's on your mind, J Buff?
Hello? Can you hear me?
Hey, yep.
Oh, okay. Perfect. So sorry, I'm actually cooking while I'm listening to this, and
Oh no, you're good.
I may have missed some things, or you may have responded to something that I'm about to say. But I was curious what you if you had already responded to the Euthyphro dilemma, in terms of like the idea that is something good because God commands it, or does God command something because it's good? I would love to hear what your response is to that, if you haven't already.
Sure. Nobody has actually brought that up yet. If you don't mind, just for anybody who may not be familiar with the dilemma, perhaps you could kind of explain a bit what the dilemma is and the problem that it poses.
Yeah, sure. So I and I'm doing this while distracted, but my best rendering of it is, again, it's that question that's posed of, is something good because God commands it, or does God command it because it's good? And it seems the idea is supposed to be that if you answer the question by basically going with the first half of that statement, so something is good because God commands it, then in that sense it would make morality basically arbitrary. Because God could have commanded something else, and obviously, he could have commanded whatever, murder, rape, or anything else. So it would make it arbitrary. Whereas if you take the other horn of the argument that God commands something because it's good, it would seem to make morality independent of God. Like God doesn't, the morality is not necessarily dependent on God. God is almost like just commanding something from a rule book that is, kind of prior to him in some sense. So yeah, hopefully I explained some of that well. If people, I assume a lot of people are already somewhat familiar with it, but yeah,
Sure. No,
that's how I would break it down.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a good explanation. So the first thing I want to point out is that a true dilemma has the form of A or not A, and then it tries to show that there's a problem with both. Both A and not A are problems. But in this case, we don't have the form A or not A, and so there could be a third option, and I think there is a third option. And so I don't think that things are good because God commands them, and I don't think that God commands them because they're good. I think that God is the good, and so that God is identical to the good. And I also think that we need to be careful and make a distinction between moral duties and what we ought or ought not do, and moral values, things that are good or evil. So things that are good or evil, things like justice, mercy, honesty, things like that. Whereas moral duties are things that you ought or ought not do. You ought to love your neighbor. You ought not, swindle everyone who has trusted you. And so we want to make a distinction there. And so we can ask, with that distinction in mind, God doesn't command his own traits to be good. They just are good in virtue of, they just are good. That's what they are. That's what it is to be good, is to be a character trait of God's. So then we can maybe focus more on, and I've seen the Youth for Us sort of changed a bit to look at God's commands and say, well, does God command something because it's right, or is it right because he commanded it? And then the answer is, on divine command theory, it's right because he's commanded it. And then the worry that's usually pushed back is that, well, then that's arbitrary. So what arbitrary means when it comes to decisions, or when it comes to things that you're commanding or prohibiting or whatever, it's arbitrary if there's no reasons for it. It's arbitrary if you don't have reasons for issuing the command. And so, for example, the law of the land in the United States, let's say that there's a law, and there is a law about construction, that you have to have a certain number of, smoke detectors in your home. While it certainly is true that it's the law because it was, commanded by whatever jurisdiction or whatever municipality commanded it, but it wouldn't be arbitrary. It's not arbitrary that they decided you have to have smoke detectors in a house if you're gonna build it for occupancy. They have reasons. So then we'd ask, okay, well, what about God's reasons? What are God's reasons? Well, I suspect, that God commands things because he finds them to be good or evil. That is to say, he commands them because they correspond or don't correspond to his nature. So he might say, murdering children, for example, that he thinks it could be the case that the act of murdering children is incongruent with his morally good nature, and so he prohibits it. And before, one way that people respond to that is to say, well, if God has moral reasons for commanding it, then perhaps those moral reasons are good enough for us to do it. So maybe that, if it really is evil to kill children, then maybe it's being evil is enough for us to avoid it. And maybe that's a prudential reason, but you wouldn't be obligated to avoid it. That comes back to what's known as like the is-ought problem. The fact that it is evil, that would give God a reason to prohibit it, but that wouldn't be enough to say you ought to avoid it just because it is evil. Even though we know that it's true that you ought to avoid evils, the fact that it's evil isn't enough to explain why you ought to avoid it. If that makes sense, it's not clear how you would derive that ought from the fact of what it is. It seems like you would need something more, and divine command theory provides that something more. And I don't think that God's decisions are arbitrary, even though we're adopting that second horn of the dilemma for God's commands for the reasons I've given.
I see. Got it. Yeah, that makes a lot more sense. I think one thing I wanted to comment on too is that you mentioned, for example, like some of God's traits, for example, like justice and mercy, that those things are good, and you say those things are good basically because God is good, right? It's
sort
is that
close
right?
to that. Close to that, yeah. I would say
Okay.
I'd say that it's not because it is though like God's character is prior to them being good. That's what I think of when you say because. I think that like one leads to the other. Rather, I'm saying that there's like an identity relationship going on. That what it is to be good is to be God's character traits.
Got it. And I guess hopefully you can speak to this because I'm gonna try to see if I can make sense of what's going on in my head when you're speaking about this stuff. Is when you say God is good, I guess I'm having trouble understanding what then is meant by good. Like if good is just equivalent to whatever God's traits are or whatever God's character is or nature, then it seems you're just saying God is God, right? Like what does good mean then? If good is nothing more than God's traits, like are we saying anything when we say that God is good? Like what are we saying?
Yeah, so there's kind of two responses I would give to that. First is this is an objection to the semantic utility of certain language when applied to God. And we, even if we conceded that completely and say that there's no semantic utility in using the term good and replying to God, that wouldn't do anything to undermine the claim that God grounds moral values or moral duties. And so the objection, even if wildly successful in everything it wants to do, it wouldn't actually undermine God's grounding of moral facts. And so it wouldn't harm the argument. Nonetheless, I think it's a good concern. And so we'd ask, okay, well, what do we mean by that? Well, what I think we mean, what I suspect we mean when we say that God is good, is that it's not so much I'd almost say it's like phenomenological in a sense. That when we say God is good, what we're saying is that God corresponds to what we perceive as moral goodness. Now, we're going to have wrong perceptions, and people do have wrong perceptions of God, obviously, because people have contradictory perceptions of God. And so one of them must be wrong, or perhaps all of them. But nonetheless, when we say that God is good, what I think we're saying is we have this moral experience of goodness, of these moral values, and we're saying that God corresponds to that. And I think that's what we're saying when we say that God is good. And so, in that sense, I think that there is a semantic utility because we're saying that God, this concept of God, corresponds to this experience that we have.
Got it.
Is that
Awesome.
fair?
Yeah,
Or do you...
I think, yeah, no, that's fair. I mean, I don't have any other questions, but I appreciate that, and I absolutely do think I would agree that even that objection, successful or not, it wouldn't harm the actual premises of the argument. So I agree with that 100%. But
Okay.
yeah, thank you.
Sounds good. Well, thanks, J Buff.
Yep.
All right. I can't think of any other objections. Let me see. Oh, we got Joel back. Everybody cross your fingers immediately. Let's see. Joel, can we hear you?
I don't know. Can
Hooray!
you?
Yes.
Nice. That's what's up.
Amazing. That's two
Yeah, so
two
I
miracles
don't
in
know
one
where.
night. Two miracles in one night. Caleb would be so excited.
Maximal facts, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, I forgot where we kind of stopped off. Did you say something about? So you responded to the bruteness
hmm
thing, and you talked about what Wielenberg was doing, and yeah, then you talked about you know, you gave two responses to what Craig calls the "so's your old man" objection
Yeah.
to
hmm
what Wielenberg does to him. Um,
I do. I
then
do.
you said something after that, right? I
Yeah.
forgot what you said after that.
And to be fair, I actually think I'm not sure that that was a fair response to Wielenberg because I mean it seems like it seems like Wielenberg had a point if he's right and theism has to appeal to brute facts just as much as atheism, then yeah, maybe it's a so's your
Hmm.
old man response, but it's an effective one. And so,
Hmm.
so yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that Wielenberg was off base. I just think he's wrong that it's true of theism. But if it were true of theism, then that would be a perfectly fine response to the moral argument.
Yeah, you said something about like it would be analytically true
hmm
on theism that like God has like some moral authority to give these commands,
Yeah.
or
hmm
what was the second one? It was like
Yeah.
it
So
was
my preferred view is that it's analytically true of God that God has moral authority. That the Christian's conception of God, that that's part of what we mean by God, is a being with such authority. And so I think that if somebody were to ask, okay, but why think that on the Christian worldview, the Christian God has moral authority? I'd say, well, you either don't understand what the Christians mean by God or what the Christian worldview entails. And so I think that that yeah, it is analytically true for that reason. You can deny that the Christian God exists, but it's hard for me to understand how someone could accept that the Christian God exists, but think that God, so described, lacks moral authority, because then it wouldn't be the Christian God; it would be some other concept. And so that's my preferred way of thinking about it. However, I do think there is an alternative. If you don't buy that, then I think that it's analytically true of creators, that creators have authority or prerogative over the creation. And so in that case, we're not grounding it in an analytic truth about God. We're grounding it first in a historical act of God's having created us, and then in the analytic truth of the concept of a creator, what it means to be creator. And even Waylenberg says that he agrees that it's true that creators have, and I had an interaction with him about this, so I know what his views are here. Even though it's analytically true of, I'm sorry, even though it's true of creators that creators have prerogatives over their creation, he would say it's just a brute fact that it's true. He would say that it's not analytically true; it's a brute fact that it's true. I don't. I think that's, I guess, an easy route to go. I don't know why we wouldn't think it's analytically true, since whenever we have the concept of a creator, we have this concept of it being true, but or analytically true. But yeah, again, that kind of, for me, goes back to, should we prefer explicability over inexplicability? When we have a ready and seemingly viable option of saying it's analytically true of a creator, that it has authority over its creation, then why opt for brute fact when we can just say, well, it's analytically true. There's a 1-to-1. Whenever there's a creator, that creator has authority. That's what I would say there. But again, when it comes to moral duties, I prefer to lean towards moral authority. I think that seems to be more clearly what the Christian means by God. Are you there? Oh no. I'm so sorry, Joel. I don't know why this keeps happening. I do appreciate that. If you do want to read, I believe Joel, I'm sorry, Joel, I'm going to put you back in the audience. I apologize that we can't hear you. I do believe Joel posted, if you want to look into it, I believe he posted an article from Morriston. I haven't looked fully into that, but I did read the title while we were going on here, and he said it's this one. So I think if you do want to read that paper by Morriston, it's a fascinating read, and I do think that it's very thought-provoking, and so I would encourage you to read it. But yeah, he's got it posted in there. We're coming close to time anyway, and it looks like there's nobody else in the queue. So I just want to say, well, we got one more, Son of Leto. Leto will be last. All right, Leto, I got an invite out to you. You'll have to hit another button at the top to come on screen here. Hey, Leto, how you doing? What's on your mind? Hello? Oh, I can hear you, but just barely.
Okay, how about now? Is that better?
Yep, I hear you perfectly fine now. Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, I was on my Bluetooth speaker.
Oh, you're good.
So I know earlier we were talking, you were chatting about basically God is, and I'm at work, so I'm only half listening to this.
Okay.
But it's God is. Someone brought an objection that God's goodness would be, to say that God is good is just to say something redundant about God's nature. Does that make sense?
Yeah. There, I think it was
and
Jay
then-
Buff who was questioning the semantic utility of the term God when
Yeah,
good when
yeah,
applied.
yeah. And that's a pretty common objection now when you troll the internet for
Sure.
little debates and stuff. And I was wondering if maybe you could dig into that a little bit more and maybe offer some rejoinders that we can use, or maybe just maybe just dig into that a little bit. So like that objection that it's arbitrary because God is saying that God is good and that's his nature is redundant almost.
Sure.
I hope I articulated that well enough.
Yeah, no, I think you did, and we talked about it a little bit earlier. But just to kind of reiterate, I gave two responses. One was to say that even if we grant that there's no semantic utility in the term good when applied to God, that wouldn't do anything to show that God doesn't ground moral facts. That would just be a consequence of God grounding moral facts. And so even if we grant the objection in its entirety and we don't have any rejoinders, it wouldn't undermine our case for God's existence from moral facts. And so that's my first response. My second response is I think that when we say that God is good, what we're saying, we're comparing God not to the ontology of goodness, but to our experience of goodness. So we're saying that we have this experience of moral goodness. We experience justice. We experience mercy. We experience these things as good. and we're saying that God corresponds to that moral experience. And so when we say God, we're referring to the concept of the person of God, and when we say is good, we're referring to our experience of these moral qualities of justice, peace, mercy, and all these sorts of things. And so I do think it has a semantic utility because it's not comparing God to God, it's comparing God to our moral experience of these virtues. And I do actually think one objection that comes up a lot that we haven't discussed tonight is people say that different cultures have different moral values. I actually disagree with that. I think that cultures have much the same moral values. I think that they apply them differently. So I don't think there is I'm certainly not aware of a culture that embraces cruelty as a good. They just disagree about what it is to be cruel. So, for example, in Rwanda, they didn't think that it was cruel to murder the Tutsis because the Tutsis weren't really people. And so they don't disagree that cruelty is evil. They just disagree about when it counts as cruelty. And so I'm not entirely sure. And C.S. Lewis actually makes the same case that, it'd be hard to imagine a culture that actually embraced evils as good, actual evils as good. But yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, thank you.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Leto. Okay, well, yeah, we're pushing up on time here. We usually go for about an hour and a half. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I really appreciate it. Please do check out our future events. We got in the top tab up at the left. We've got 2 more scheduled, I believe, right now. We're going to have another one scheduled shortly. But yeah, I appreciate you all coming. I hope it's been helpful for you. And thank you again for being part of the server. It's really encouraging to have people show up to these events. Obviously, we put a lot of effort into the server and everything, and it's just really encouraging to have you show up. So thank you for that, and I hope you have a great rest of your evening. Bye-bye.